Hi, my name is Julie Becker, and the presentation I'm giving today is called Time to Get Uncomfortable and has to do with museum-based climate change communication. The picture at the bottom here was taken a bit more than 3 years ago as the leaders of the Science Center field were gathered in Porto, Portugal, and signed the so-called Tokyo Protocol on the role of science centers and science museums worldwide in support of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So at the time when this photo was taken, I was working for Excite, the European network of science centers and museums, whose conference these leaders and many of their staff were attending. And I was watching with one eye as this picture was being taken, and then with the other eyes, I was keeping track of the preparations of a small reception that was going to follow this signature. And I was feeling happy. This protocol to me was a reason for hope and empowerment. True to its values, our sector was joining a global effort to make the world a better place. We were embracing a framework, the SDGs, that was identifying pressing challenges for the future of our planet, with the tackling of climate change, which is a cause close to my heart, high on the agenda. The SDGs were, and still are, a clear framework that sets specific objectives while avoiding silos. They were, and still are, known worldwide by a large diversity of stakeholders, thus giving us a common language for collaboration with a wide range of governmental and non-governmental organizations, businesses, citizens. So to me, this Tokyo Protocol really sounded like great news, like a vision that every member of staff working for a science center or a science museum worldwide could share a vision, a tool articulating their daily jobs with something bigger, giving their daily endeavors a global meaning. Later that night, I joined friends from around the world, exhibition developers, learning officers, partnership managers, and I was sharing my enthusiasm for the Tokyo Protocol. And at first, I was rather surprised by their off-the-record reaction. They weren't feeling uplifted or galvanized like me. They were anxious. They felt like the weight of the world had just been put on their shoulders. It was now their task to engage often reluctant audiences with all these big problems. And they felt like they didn't have the right tools for that, in particular around climate change, which is the specific challenge I'm now going to focus on from here onwards. And so seeing them so worried about the on-the-ground implementation of the Tokyo Protocol actually reminded me of the helplessness that I had felt a few years earlier when I wasn't sitting in an office in Brussels, but developing exhibitions at the Natural History Museum in London. And so this story is about 10 years old or even a bit older, and the exhibit that I will show you in a minute is no longer operating in the way that you will see it. And from what I know, the Natural History Museum itself is taking its public engagement around climate change in other directions. So it makes it a safe story to tell without hurting anyone's sensitivities. And I'm really not going to point fingers, but what I want to show is how easy it is to get climate change exhibits or climate change communication wrong. So in a minute, I'm going to launch a video of what we called the interactive wall. It was part of the Natural History Museum's new branch dedicated to museum research and curation that opened to the public in 2009. I was then part of a multidisciplinary team working on the loose brief of a multi-screen installation about the science of climate change. So at the time, and bear in mind it was 10 years ago, I didn't know much about climate change. And so together with the non-specialist members of the team, we started to interview our scientist colleagues, to read books on climate science, to watch films. And honestly, after a few weeks, we were utterly depressed. News were very, very bad. We as a species were just rushing towards a very hard climate change wall. And it seemed like those in charge of the handbrake were looking elsewhere. It was a terrible story. And we really didn't know what to do with it exhibition-wise. We also didn't know what to do with it on a personal level. And we were really too shy to share our anxiety feelings with each other. Let me launch the video now. So this is what we created in the end. Let me explain how it works while you will discover the images. So at first, this wall was displaying beautiful images of the natural world and was based in color LED lighting that was pulsating in a reassuring blue or green, depending on the mode you were in. And as visitors got closer, a motion capture system was registering activity in the space, and as a result, changing the color of the light towards a more alarming yellow, orange, and even red. Most of the screens were touch screens and unveiled information about museum research on the effects of climate change, mostly centered on monitoring biodiversity loss and showing the effect of human activities on nature in pictures. In hindsight, I can now realize that this exhibit was basically saying, look at this beautiful nature, well, we're destroying it in terrible ways. And we at the museum have graphs that prove it, and we are all guilty. Now, go deal with it. But this experience stayed as an unresolved, frustrating problem in a corner of my mind. And when I heard my museum practitioners' friends' anxiety when confronted with the daunting task of making the Tokyo Protocol a reality on the ground, I felt like the best thing I could do for them, and maybe for the planet, was to use some of the time and agency I had as the editor of the Spokes magazine, the magazine of Excite, the European Network of Science Centers and Museums. So use this time to gather a sort of toolkit for practitioners. And so this resulted in an article aimed at anyone working on climate change communication in a museum context. And I hope that it's the case of some of you in the audience. Of course, back in 2009, when we were struggling with that exhibit, we weren't the only ones who were wondering how to tell the climate change story. If we had asked around, we would have realized that there were also environmentalists, psychologists, or think tanks working on the topic. And the good news is that in the past 10 years, there has been a lot done to unpack this challenge. I had the chance to read some of this literature and to interview some of the writers or scientists working on the topic, and to gather it all in the article I told you about. I can't summarize everything in a few minutes, so what I'm trying to do in this talk is to make you aware of the fact that there is a growing, robust basis out there for anyone wanting to do evidence-based climate change communication. So someone like George Marshall, for instance, whose quote you can read on this slide, wrote an entire book to unpack the problem that's called Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. Others, like Rayner and Means, have very usefully analyzed some of the strategies that we all develop when confronted with unwelcome messages like climate change. They argue that the adaptive coping that we need to aim for, as opposed to denial strategies and maladapting coping strategies. So this adaptive coping is accepting the science and the accompanying emotions. and that it's a bit like the final stages of grieving or mourning. So accepting the science and the accompanying emotions, that's precisely what we did not do when we were working on that climate wall exhibit. And with hindsight, I've realized that there were a lot of wrong things with this exhibit. And so I'm hoping that if I were starting again today, having learned from others, I would avoid these pitfalls, and that you will too. And that's already a good start. The same George Marshall, whose book I was showing earlier, often says that the secret of good communication is to avoid bad communication. And so if I go back to this interactive wall, there were 5 main problems with it, in my opinion. The first one is that we were promising hell to guilty audiences. There were very loaded moral undertones in what we were doing, and without realizing the interaction mode that we were offering to visitors is that the more active they were, the more distraction they were causing, which is absolutely distressing if you think about it. We also left audiences hurt and disempowered. We basically took them on this visitor journey, which all museum professionals do when they plan programs or exhibits. And then we just left them, we abandoned them. We dropped facts on them and let them deal with it. There was no agency offered, no what next, not a space to breathe and reflect on what they had just done with the exhibits. A third mistake that we made is that at the time, the topic of climate change was starting to get polarized, at least in the UK and the US. And we completely ignored that or believed that an avalanche of facts would overcome that polarization, which has been proven not to work since. A fourth mistake we made was that we didn't seek outside help. And the fifth one is that we didn't acknowledge the emotional burden on ourselves that tackling such a difficult topic on a daily basis was provoking. So if you want to go further, you can dig into the work of people who are bridging climate science and social psychology, and a lot of interesting reports and toolkits have been written on the topic. You need to start with a few basic concepts to understand how brains, biases, values, or opinion forming works, and that of your audiences, but also your own. It's a very introspective journey to some extent. And this will give you a very good basis to start from. And so all the concepts that I'm listing here on these slides are also explained in the article I wrote. And before I share the QR code that leads to that article, which is much more a story and a list of references than an academic paper, let me sum up my message to you in 3 points. The first one is, please acknowledge the emotional consequences of the climate change story, both for yourself and visitors. Don't let go of the hand when it gets hard, basically. Second, read the 101 of social psychology applied to the topic to at least avoid bad communication. And third, don't do it on your own. There are academics or perhaps activists, citizens, civil society organizations working on this topic for longer than you have been. Seek their help. And so my final slide, here you can see the QR code that will take you to the 2-part article that I wrote on the topic about 2 years ago. It's really meant as a conceptual toolbox for practitioners, and it's based on the work of many, many brilliant people and organizations whose reports really urge you to discover. All the references and resources are listed at the end of the piece. And so thank you very much for listening today, and I hope that this work can be of value to some of you. Thank you.